Hey everybody, this is Catalin and welcome to another episode of our show. Today I have Alan with me and I'm going to give him a little bit of an introduction and then he's going to introduce himself a lot better. So Alan is the CEO of TrackMaven, the marketing insights company. He's also the author of Creative Curve, a book that overturns the mythology around creative genius and reveals the science and secrets behind achieving breakout commercial success in any field. That's really cool. So read his book. Loved it. We're going to talk about him and his company and his new book that was, I think it's a really, really interesting book and I love for you guys to check it out as well. So thank you, Alan, for taking the time for the interview and looking forward to chatting with you today.
Thanks for having me, man.
So let's start with this. If you can, and for the people that do not know you, right? Like if you can give us a little bit of a background story of where did everything start from you? How you actually ended up to today.
Yeah, sure. So I started a company right after college called TrackMaven, which has been around now for about 6 years, which is kind of crazy. And the company is about 60 people. And what we do is we help marketers find patterns in their data. So like what's working for them, what's not working, what should they do more of, what should they do less of. And so I've always been really fascinated by this intersection between right brain and left brain, right? Can you apply left brain principles to things like creativity and art and marketing to get better, smarter, more efficient on them? And so I'm doing this for a while. I work with a lot of big brands like MBA, Saks Fifth Avenue. We've done work with GE, Microsoft, all sorts of fun folks. And the thing I realized was that, you talk to these marketers, some of the most creative people on the planet, and they still say things like, well, I'm not that creative. Like I'm not a genius. And I found this very dispiriting. I'm someone who's read a lot about creativity. I'm really interested in the topic. And I was like, that's not actually the truth of creativity. And I realized that, most people have this sort of warped notion of creativity, which is that creativity is this magical, mystical thing that's bestowed upon a few and no one else has it. And most people don't realize that there's actually been a ton of science on creativity. We know a lot about how it works. We know a lot about how to get better at it. And so the book really came from this sort of like frustration that people were limiting themselves. And so, so 3 years later, the book's about to come out. Depending on where it airs, it might already have come out.
Right. And talking about the book, let's start with the title. So Creative Curve. What is the creative curve? And we're going to talk about the process of actually creating the book, because like I told you before we actually started the chat, like I think after reading it, I was like, man, there's so much work in these interviews and research and everything else. So really curious about how that process went. But first, how did you just choose the title and how did you thought about creating a book in the first place?
So the creative curve is a sort of a more fun name for this phenomenon in science. It's called the inverted U relationship between familiarity and preference. And so let me break that down. So basically what scientists have found is that there's a U-shape, an upside down U-shaped relationship between how often we're exposed to something and how much we like it. So when we first see something new, we don't like it. It's too unfamiliar. We think it might be risky, might be unsafe. Think about the first time you heard that new Drake song. You're like, oh, this is like not that good. But the more we're exposed to something, we start to fear it less. And we're actually willing to check it out, to spend energy on it. This can be music, art, food, all sorts of different stuff. And so then the more we're exposed to something, the more we like it. But then it reaches a point where our other biological urge, our seeking of novelty, starts to take effect, where we start to get bored of things. And we've been exposed to it too much. So the more we're exposed to it, we start liking it less and less. And hence there's this inverted U-shaped relationship where the more you see something, the more you like it up until a point, and then you start liking it less and less with each additional exposure. And so rather than call the book the inverted U relationship between preference and familiarity, I called it the creative curve because it sounded better. But basically this is a really critical understanding for anyone who wants to do anything creative, which is that creative success comes from getting that right intersection of the familiar and the novel. It's not about creating things that are radically new. As people, we don't like things that are radically new. This is one of the biggest myths about creativity. We talk about innovation, newness, uniqueness, creating something so different. But actually the ideas that tend to take hold in our culture, the ideas that have a blend of the familiar and the novel, think about the original Star Wars, was a Western in space, right? Right now in America, there's this trend around sushi burritos that is like taking over. It's sushi, but it's a burrito, right? And so over and over again, you see that the ideas that really take off are blending familiar and novelty.
Right. And what do you think, talking about first, I mean, the first name would probably sell like 300 books in academia, so I get why you chose that. But second, what do you think are a couple of other myths that a lot of people have about creativity, and can we briefly talk about them?
Oh my God, there's so many. I mean, one of the ones that I think is really, really dangerous is that people have this belief that, you know, genius and IQ are go hand in hand with creativity, that you have to be an IQ genius to be a creative genius. And the issue is that this is so fundamentally not true. I mean, there's all these studies. I mean, you know, the thing that people have to understand is that IQ is measuring a very narrow set of cognitive skills, and that's what it's measuring. It's not measuring anything else. It's not measuring every type of intelligence. It's actually a very narrow set of cognitive skills. And when they do studies where they actually compare IQ to creativity, what they find is that once you get to an IQ of 104, which is basically average, it turns out there's no correlation between IQ and creativity. So that means half the world, billions and billions of people, have the same creative potential. But we talk about creativity as if it's like 4 people, right, that have it. It's like, every generation, there's like 5 people who are like, they're the geniuses, and everyone else is screwed. And so the reality is that we all have, assuming you have a reasonable IQ, we all have the same creative potential. It even gets scarier in just terms of how wrong this is. I mean, the guy who brought the IQ test to America is this guy, Lewis Terman, who was a professor at Stanford. And he Americanized the IQ test and called it the Stanford Binet IQ test. And one thing he did is he took thousands of children in California and he tested them for IQ when they were very young, with the idea of saying, okay, let's take the ones with genius level IQs and let's follow them throughout their life. Let's see what happens. And every 5 years they get a survey. Even after he died, his proteges kept doing it. And one like creepy little footnote is he called these kids his termites, which is really like, ugh, bad branding. But anyway, what's so interesting is when you took these thousands of kids who had genius level IQs, followed them for decades, what they found, they're pretty normal. Normal levels of suicide, depression, alcoholism, and normal levels of success. There were mechanics, there were retail clerks. None of them won a Nobel Prize. There weren't any big mainstream household names. In fact, the only 2 kids he tested that later went on to win a Nobel Prize were 2 kids who did not make the genius threshold. And so we have this myth that IQ and creativity are like this. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth.
Right. So, I get that. Like, everybody has kind of the same baseline. And that's not something that only a few of us have. So that makes sense to me. At the same time, it's probably that first, a lot of people have different skill sets. So some are more analytical, some are more, so like left brain, right brain. So that's one of the things. But the other thing is, if people say they're not creative, how do they go about actually approaching that as a skill and training and actually empowering more of it to come out? Like, is there some things that people can do?
Yeah. So we have a sort of a fundamental misunderstanding around neuroscience that is really problematic in our society. So when you think about like going to the gym, when you go to the gym, you think, okay, I'm going to lift weights, I'm going to get more muscular. And sure, there's some like physical constraints, right? But if you really wanted to work hard enough, you could get a lot more muscular if you wanted. Not saying you're in bad shape, just saying you could get more muscular.
Right.
Our brain actually works much the same way. We have this thing called neurogenesis, which is basically the idea that every day our brain creates thousands of new brain cells. And these brain cells actually operate in the same way you think about your muscle being repaired. These brain cells actually go to the parts of your brain that are the most active right then. They're kind of like saying, okay, shit, this is like a lot of stuff's happening over here. We're going to go over here. And what you found is when you actually look at studies, our brains actually structurally change based on the tasks we do. So there's a really well-known study that took cab drivers in London. And it said, okay, let's do MRIs of cab drivers in London. And what they found is that the longer that someone's a cab driver, the bigger the part of their brain that's tied to visual and navigational skills got. Literally, being a cab driver changed their brain. They got better at it on this biological level. And so oftentimes one of the problems we have in our culture is that we assume that our brains are very static when in fact they're very, very adaptable. And so often when you think about things like natural born talent, what we're really talking about is just kids who started early. So by the time they're 18, sure, they've adapted a lot to whatever the challenges that they're trying to deal with are. And so if you're an adult, the big trick if you're an adult is you got to think about skill development more like how you might think about a video game. So in a video game, one of the things they do to get you addicted is they make it very, very easy in the beginning. So it's very easy to level up in the beginning. This is the opposite of skill development. In skill development, it's very hard in the beginning. It gets much easier later on. And so your task, if you want to learn something, is one, find some people who are going to motivate you through the hard part. And two, break down the skill into much, much smaller pieces. This is called deliberate practice. And it's the idea, instead of saying, I'm going to practice basketball by playing a game. It's like, no, I'm going to practice left-handed mid-court dribbling over and over and over again. And judge yourself based on the progress on those micro skills rather than judging yourself on the progress of the entire set of the skill.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting. Also, did you, I've read somewhere really briefly this idea that muscle memory also doesn't exist, and it's also neuron memory. It's not actual muscles that have a memory. So it's probably the same thing that you're noticing and talking about. So that's really interesting. Also, you mentioned something in the book, and this is where I stopped reading, but I'm going to finish the book later, is the 4 laws. That was like, man, I got to read it, but I cannot finish it now. The 4 laws of the creative curve. Let's just briefly mention them, because I thought that was really interesting, and it kind of gives people the scope of what really that means.
Yeah, so for the book, how it's broken up is the first half of the book is exploring the myths around creativity and what the science and history actually tells us about how creativity works. The second half of the book, I interviewed about 25 living creative geniuses. These are like billionaires like David Rubenstein, Tony and Oscar Award winners like the songwriting duo Pasek and Paul, Nita Jacobson, who's the president of Walt Disney Motion Pictures. And I interviewed these 25 living creative geniuses about their creative process. What did they do? What did they not do? What worked? What didn't work? And trying to really dig in and understand how they got better at creativity. And what I found was there's these 4 things. So I call them the 4 laws of the creative curve. These 4 things that appeared over and over again that these creators did to actually enhance their creativity. And so it's like hundreds, it's 100 pages to describe it. So it's hard to go into detail, but the high level of it is these 4 things. The first one was consumption. So it turns out that creators consume a lot more content than non-creators do. While most people think that creators are constantly doing, they're actually spending a lot of time consuming. Second is imitation. So creators actually, a lot of times early on, spend a lot of time imitating other great creatives. That's a big part of the learning process. The third thing is building a creative community. So these great creators, they all built creative communities around them. They weren't isolated. They had other people in their orbit. And then fourth and finally was data-driven iterations. So we think about creators as like very linear. So like I go into a cabin in the woods, I write my great novel, I come out after I wrote the end, the book is done. But actually the best creators spend a huge amount of energy getting feedback on what they're doing from their audience and iterating along the way. And they actually view feedback as an essential part of the process. And so those 4 things I found, all of the creators I interviewed did, and that was really interesting to me.
Let's briefly talk about the consumption part, because I think most people see creativity as like you come with something out of thin air. And what you're saying essentially describes creativity as just connecting dots in a new way, because that's what you're consuming, right?
The way to think about it, so there's actually a lot of science around aha moments and flashes of genius. And basically all aha moments is we have 2 different ways we process information, right? Our left brain does logical processing, our right brain does more divergent metaphorical processing. Your right brain does its processing subconsciously. That's the big thing. And it only pops into consciousness once it has an answer. And that's the aha. But here's the thing. You can't connect the dots if you don't have any dots. So the things that people have aha moments about are the things they have lots of dots about. I mean, Paul McCartney literally played in a cover band, right, before he started writing original music. J.K. Rowling spent her whole childhood locked in her bedroom reading books to get away from her parents who were fighting. Nita Jacobson, who I interviewed, started her career as a script reader. And so what you see over and over again is that this consumption thing is very critical. And it's not wide consumption. It's not Twitter, right? It's actually very narrow and deep. They go very, very deep on one specific topic so that they have this sort of very specialized knowledge, which then their right brain starts connecting together.
Right. I think that's really powerful because it kind of demystifies when people say that they don't have any power on it because they just can't come up with stuff on the fly, which is not the truth. One thing that I noted down is I would love if you could share with us, and I have 2 extra questions and we'll end the episode, but one of the things I would really love to hear is if you could tell us one of the most impactful stories that you've got from interviewing so many people that got them to some realization about creativity or something else that really made an impact on you.
I mean, the thing that I found was so interesting was I interviewed David Rubenstein, billionaire, co-founder of Carlyle Group, has the David Rubenstein show on Bloomberg TV. And it was so interesting. This guy's a billionaire, right? He's in his late 60s. He's on the board of the Smithsonian Institution, the Kennedy Center. Like, he literally, when there was an earthquake in Washington, D.C., he paid personally for the money to repair the Washington Monument. So, like, the guy's on the king of the world. And, like, we got tea together. And, like, he is just so nice to everyone, the waiters, people who would come up and say hi, well-wishers, friends, acquaintances, people he would see. And he's constantly curious. He's constantly consuming information. And he's constantly wanting to ingest material. And so it was interesting to see someone in their late 60s who very, very rich, very successful, who's constantly taking information in.
Right. And always learning, always consuming. Got it. One last thing is, what motivates you in all you're doing, and what's the best advice you've ever got from a person or a book? So there's actually 2 things. But
the thing that motivates me is I really, really, really want people to live up to their potential across lots of different aspects, whether that's creatively, personally, emotionally. I get sort of frustrated by the idea of like a wasted time or wasted life, and I think that comes from my own very deep fear of death, and so I think that sort of perseverates out. And then the best advice I ever got is really to focus on just doing. I think so many people, we apply gates to ourselves and we say, well, once this happens, I'll do that. Or once that happens, I'll give myself permission to try that. And you have to just give yourself permission and just go, because otherwise there's never going to be a right time. There's never going to be a right day. There's never going to be a right year. You just have to start going.
Got it. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Alan, for your time. I think this was a really short and to the point interview that gave people the perspective of what your book is and what creativity is. And I think it's such an interesting topic, and it's where all the innovation comes from. So it's worth the time to actually go and investigate more about this. So Creative Curve, we're going to have a link to his book in the description somewhere so you can pick it up on Amazon or all the major bookstores and everything else. But thank you so much, Alan, for your time. And thank you everybody that's listening. See you next time.
See you, dude.